That's not cool, bud. Not cool at all. All right, so episode 5 of Constellation is here, and I think things are more confusing now. So I'm gonna do my best to break down this episode titled 5 Miles Out, the sound is clearest, and see if we can make any sense of all of the new information we've got here. If you enjoy these videos, be sure to subscribe for future episode breakdowns and the end of season community live stream where we'll all come together and chat about what we thought of the season. All right, let's get to it. This episode picks up right where we left off last episode after Joe pushed Magnus down, and it appears he didn't die after all. The weight of everything going on sends Joe into a bit of a panic as she loads Alice in the car and tells her that they're going on a little adventure. Joe swings by the office and attempts to download some files, but finds that she doesn't have access. But she is able to play her FaceTime call with Alice before the events out on the ISS, and she seems to pay special attention to the part where she says they're doing something very fiddly at the cow. But what I found most interesting here is that in this recording, Joe and Alice are conversing in English, and at the end of the episode, we hear another recording where Joe and Alice are speaking in Swedish. I think this minor detail is actually going to end up being vitally important to many aspects of this episode, so just remember this as we keep going. After listening to the recording, Joe steals the cow device and hits the road. After the intro, we find Henry awoken from his sleep by Bud, who appears to be accessing him through his consciousness as if he's figured out how to leverage quantum entanglement to his advantage. Henry hears a knock at the door while taking a bath, and we see him open up to no one. However, Bud can be seen observing Henry through the mirror behind him. Definitely seems like Bud's just messing with Henry at this point, and it only gets worse from here. Next, Irene gives Henry a call and discusses the recent Nobel Prize. She reads from the newspaper, which talks about particles existing in an entangled state, and says that what happens to one of the particles determines what happens to the other, even if they're far apart. Henry then has a sort of vision into Bud's world where he sees a photo of Bud as well as his book. And this scene is really laying the groundwork for what's to come later in the episode as we see more of this quantum entanglement taking place. More on that in a bit. We then see Joe on board a ferry where she gives Ilya a call to ask him about his medication. Ilya then randomly says, "Do you know the ISS is full of cracks? It's like an old china teacup," which seems incredibly random, but surely there's a reason for this. I honestly couldn't figure out why he would say this at this point in this conversation, so if you have any ideas, please let me know down in the comments. Anyway, Joe shares what she found out about being given her lithium pills as opposed to the vitamins everyone else got. She theorizes she was given these pills because of what she saw in space and asks Ilya to have his pills tested and report back. Next, we find Bud leaving voicemails with various family members and Henry washing up in the work bathroom where he can hear Bud talking. Henry writes, "Leave me alone," in the steamed up mirror, which Bud can see on his end as well. Joe and Alice stop for a bite to eat, and Joe asks Alice what she's afraid of. Alice says it's the Valya, which is a person that tricks her into not playing and is the reason she's been hiding so much. And now I'm thinking that Magnus may have been talking about the Valya when he told Alice in the last episode not to worry because he wouldn't see her out at the cabin. Joe asks what she is, and Alice says, "I don't know, she's a dream," so Joe asks her to draw the Valya before making a phone call to the Skagerrak Observatory that sent her the tapes in the last episode. After a pretty odd and unwelcoming phone call, Joe Googles them and finds an interview with Irene where she claims Skagerrak was using staged recordings to attempt to bribe NASA astronauts, and in the interview, Irene calls them cranks and criminals. Joe then heads outside and calls Magnus and Frederick, who try to persuade her to return home for treatment, which she seems to be entertaining. But then Alice comes outside with a drawing of the Valya, which looks identical to the cosmonaut Joe had seen up in space, and after seeing this drawing, Joe ends the call. Next, we see Ilya having his pills tested and learning that they're just vitamin D and B with no traces of lithium. He then attempts to have some records pulled, but is told they're no longer available. Irene then finds Ilya and asks why he was pulling those records, and he says, "Why do you ask?" Irene then moves on and says Joe is missing after assaulting her husband and that she should contact Irene if she wants help, which I'm thinking is probably not true. We're on to you, Irene. Joe then arrives at the Skagerrak Observatory where she meets Wally and Lawrence and says she'd like to know more about what they recorded. Joe explains what happened up on the ISS, and Wally says she knows because Lawrence heard it all on one of their ghost tapes. Wally explains that they'd been listening to the recordings since the 1940s, and after a bit more backstory, Alice spots Henry in a photo, and Lawrence says that he came by in 1982 to get the Apollo 18 tapes. Joe recounts that there was an accident on Apollo 18 and that Henry was the only survivor, but that he was a drunk and a failure, unlike how he is today. They head out to the boat to listen to the tapes, and Alice pockets a phone on the way. On their walk to the boat, Wally tells a story from 1984 about 6 cosmonauts who witnessed what they described as angels on multiple occasions. Lawrence says this was reported in the newspapers and that he believes them. Wally says people see things up there, and when they get back home, they seem to go crazy. On the boat, Wally explains that the noise they're picking up in the recording must be decoded, and they found that you must go to a liminal place, like out on the water, to be able to hear. She then plays a recording of the transcript she'd sent to Joe in the last episode and says that this woman may be the corpse that Joe saw. Wally then plays a recording of Paul, which she alludes to meaning he didn't actually die up there, and then says 500 people have gone to space past the Kármán line, and many came back as addicts or crazy people. Alright, so here's what I think is actually happening with these ghost tapes. I think Wally and Lawrence have somehow figured out a way to pick up recordings of alternate realities. So when Joe hears these recordings of her speaking back to Earth while she was up on the ISS alone and assumes that people on Earth could hear her, that's actually not true. I think they weren't hearing anything at all, or potentially just really bad interference sounds, which, as we now know, must be decoded. The problem with the Skagerraks is it doesn't seem that they're entertaining this possibility of multiple realities. Wally just says something about space is wrong. She does point out that it's odd that they have a recording of Irene's spaceship burning up, but then her returning home safely, and the recording of Paul seemingly being fine, but then Joe returning in his place. But it doesn't seem to me like they're fully connecting the dots that there are multiple realities here, and they're crossing the lines on these recordings. As they make it back to land, Alice gets into the phone with the code she saw back in the house and places a call to Magnus. She tells him they're headed out to the cabin and that she wants to stay with Joe to take care of her. Wally gives Joe a bag of ghost tapes to take with her, and she and Alice head for the cabin. In the most interesting scene of the episode, Henry tells Frederick he wants to go with him since Joe has the Cal device, and when Frederick pushes back, we see Bud take over Henry's body and wet himself as he lets out a rather maniacal laugh. Henry then seems to take back over and says, "I'm coming with you, I just need to change." Now, as I said earlier, this episode is taking things to a new level in terms of how this quantum entanglement is working, as we have Bud and Henry actually affecting what's going on in one another's realities. We're really starting to see how this entanglement can and probably will play out, and it seems like Bud is taking full advantage of it. Back with Joe and Alice, Joe says you've got to know how to put things in a box and leave it. Alice begins an exercise of placing her beads into boxes as metaphors for everything Joe's been dealing with. Joe runs through her list of what needs to be put away, which includes the non-existent trash bag in space, Paul's death, everything Joe's been seeing since she got home, the ghost tapes, the pills, and most importantly, her family. Joe asks Alice who the Valya is, and Alice says it's a woman floating around Earth, a dead cosmonaut, which further proves that this is Irene, who just said in a past episode that she just wants to float around the Earth.
I'm dreaming of endlessly circling the Earth.
Alice tells Joe that the Valya speaks, but it's not clear and sounds like mumbling. Joe says she wishes the tape from 1967 were clear, so Alice pulls it from the bag and begins playing it for a moment and says, "Mommy, that's the Valya." Joe grabs the tape player and finds that as she moves it closer to the Cal, it becomes crystal clear, and Alice confirms that Irene's voice is the voice of this Valya thing that has been haunting her. Next, we find Henry back in the bathroom where he calls out to Bud, who makes his appearance in the mirrors. Henry says, "You've stopped taking your pills," which is making me think the lithium is somehow playing a role in preventing the quantum entanglement, and now that Bud has stopped, he's able to cross over as he pleases and obviously even control Henry if he'd like. Henry talks about his cold atomic lab experiment and that he thinks it made everything worse. He then asks if Joe exists in Bud's reality, but Bud just says he's coming for Henry and is going to mess things up. Henry says he doesn't even know if Bud is really there, to which Bud says, "Well, I made you pee your pants," and then he disappears. Back with Joe and Alice, we seem to have caught up to the opening scene of the show where Joe is explaining what the tape says as they drive toward the cabin. However, Joe comes to a crossroads she doesn't recognize and makes the interesting decision to ignore Alice's directions and instead drives out over the frozen lake. They arrive at the cabin and Joe hears the other Alice calling out to her. Once inside, Joe plays back her own ghost tape the Skagerraks gave her, and this one consists of her and Alice having a conversation in Swedish, countering the recording Joe found at work, which had their conversation in English. This is making it crystal clear to me how people like Joe who come back from space would be presumed to be crazy people. Joe has just been given a recording of herself having a conversation with her daughter in Swedish, but the official ESA recording doesn't match it. So I can see how Joe would think there's some big conspiracy to prevent her from knowing the truth and the ESA is covering things up. But the hard truth is the ESA only knows what happened in their reality, and Joe has this insight into things happening in multiple realities, but of course she doesn't know how to process that. So as she's trying to explain it and work through everything, she looks like a crazy person. So yeah, it kind of looks like they're trying to make us think that there is this big conspiracy. Joe keeps asking, like, Frederick, like, did you know? Like, why are they giving me the lithium pills? I think they're trying to make the viewers think there's some effort going on by the ESA to prevent Joe from knowing the truth, but I don't think that's going to end up being the case. I think they legitimately don't know about these multiple reality things going on, with the exception of Henry, of course, and Irene, but I feel like they're kind of acting as rogue people and the entire organization as a whole doesn't know about it. Now, I think it's kind of cool to have figured that out, but I don't see how things could possibly end well for Joe. After hearing the recording, Alice comes out of her room and says that wasn't her because she doesn't speak Swedish. Then the episode ends with the other Alice hiking through the snow and calling out to Joe. Okay, that one was a doozy and we've got a lot to chew on. I'm not sure we got a lot of answers here, but I think we now definitely know the lithium pills prevent this crossover of quantum entanglement, and now that Bud isn't taking his, he's able to cross over seemingly as he pleases and really affect Henry's reality. And Bud clearly has a strong desire to destroy Henry, and here's why I think that is. I think Bud was actually successful in his space mission and he saved his entire crew, but then he ended up swapping realities with Henry, who lost his entire crew, who was a drunk and a failure. But then they swapped these realities and they came back, and now Bud is having to pay for Henry's mistakes by going on these cruises and giving these speeches with these conspiracy theorists. And then you've got Henry, who now gets to live as this highly revered and respected astronaut. This obviously is not sitting well with Bud. His entire life has been ruined because of this switch, and he is out for revenge. And since Joe's not taking her lithium pills, that's why she's having all these experiences she's having and seeing into both realities as well. The biggest question I have right now is, why is Alice also experiencing these weird effects? She saw the other version of herself stomping on the rabbit, she saw her mom's funeral, and she's being haunted by this Valya being, which I'm quite certain is Irene at this point. But why? Alice wasn't present when the cowl thing happened up at the ISS, but she was on a FaceTime call, so maybe the cowl device uses some Apple chip and it crossed through the FaceTime call and now she can see multiple realities. I definitely understand that Alice certainly is experiencing the same types of things that Joe is. I just can't fully understand why. If it's the FaceTime thing, I'll think that's a bit silly, but I guess I get it. If you have any ideas on the Alice situation, please let me know down in the comments. Now, I've heard the next episode 2 are very revealing, giving us a lot of answers, which I think many of us are very much ready for. So I'm really looking forward to seeing those and talking about them right here on my channel. So I hope to see you there. Thanks for watching. See you next time.